I'm Afshin Rattansi, and welcome to the season finale of Going Underground, broadcasting all around the world from the UAE at the end of a year and the first quarter of this century that has seen NATO-linked wars continue, US, UK, EU armed bombing across the Middle East, countless numbers of people killed, wounded or displaced, a rise in acute global food insecurity and a bleak NATO-aligned economy. Many thought a Trump administration 2.0 would mean a more peaceful world, but positive performances by Lockheed Martin, RTX Corporation, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics and Boeing are a testament to the bloodshed over 12 months. So how to assess the military, economic and social impact of the past year globally, and what does humanity have to look forward to in 2026? Joining me again from Chicago in the USA to tackle these questions is a multi-award winning scholar, professor of political science at the University of Chicago and co-author of bestseller The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy and How States Think, the Rationality of Foreign Policy, Professor John Mearsheimer. Professor, thanks so much for coming back on Going Underground for this season finale. You know, over the year, even the Sulzberger New York Times had a headline, "Hard choices amid unease over U.S. food benefits. For many families, delays or cuts to assistance mean stress over their next meals." But we're not going to really talk about what's happening in your country. Across 2025, he being Trump, has bombed Yemen in March, Somalia in July, Iran in June, Venezuela from October, or Venezuelan assets, poured arms into Ukraine, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, South Korea. How do you assess Trump's 2025 in the White House?
Well, I think he's basically been unsuccessful in foreign policy. Just to start with the Houthis, remember, he said he was going to finish the Houthis off and that Joe Biden had been a pussycat and he couldn't deal with the Houthis, but Trump would be able to do that. After 1 month, Trump quit and admitted the Houthis were too tough a nut to crack for him. With regard to Iran, the fact that they're talking about attacking Iran again tells you that they were not successful in June when they attacked. With regard to Gaza, he has failed to shut down that conflict and come up with a plausible solution to it. And in fact, he's guilty of genocide. With regard to Ukraine, he said that he was going to shut that one down before he entered the White House, or if he didn't do it that quickly, he'd do it after he got into the White House. He's failed there as well. And finally, he's in a giant mess with regard to Venezuela. I think he's basically backed himself into a corner. He's had military forces in the Caribbean, significant military forces for a number of weeks now, but he's not employed those forces because it's hard to see how he can use those forces to achieve the end that he wants, which is regime change and peace in Venezuela. So if you look across the board, it's been one failure after another.
Oh, you know that Trump would beg to disagree with you there as he talks about 7 wars, I think maybe 8 wars that he's solved. Let's go through them one by one. I mean, yeah, the genocide has continued, but at a slower pace. And many in the MAGA base would say, you know, if Kamala Harris had been in power, things would have been a lot worse. Do you not feel that Trump has been able to withstand the Israel lobby, the name that you conjured in your best-selling book, much more than recent presidents? And aren't you impressed by that?
I don't see any difference between Trump and Joe Biden. Both of them are basically owned by the lobby. It's an open and shut case. The idea that Trump has gotten tough with the Israelis and pushed them to do things that they don't want to do, and that therefore he's going to create peace in the Middle East is a laughable argument.
You don't think Netanyahu would have wanted to go further than the limited strikes on Iran, which resulted, of course, in the bombing of Qatar as well? You don't think another president would have followed Netanyahu's orders more closely?
Look, I think that the Israelis actually got themselves into trouble when they attacked Iran. They thought that they were going to launch what was effectively a decapitation strategy, and they were going to cripple Iran. But what happened is that the Iranians began launching ballistic missiles at Israel, and they slowly but steadily figured out how to use those weapons more effectively. So with all the ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones coming in at Israel, and Israel running out of defensive weapons that it could use to shoot down those incoming drones and missiles, the Israelis were very interested in a ceasefire. There are many people who argued that the Iranians were foolish for not continuing the war. The Iranians were moving into the driver's seat. So the idea that Israel, was on the verge of a great victory or achieved a great victory in Iran is, one of the many myths that we have here in the West of Israeli and American foreign policy.
And structural forces have less of an impact on Trump in some regions, though. All year bubbling under has been, here's a headline from the Financial Times, Trump spent hours at Epstein house with trafficking victim, email alleges. As your book on the Israel lobby showed, this is a deep structural impact across U.S. elite power. How Israel affects foreign policy, not just one guy called Jeffrey Epstein. But you personally, I didn't realize, were that involved in the Epstein saga in one way. Alan Dershowitz, who's been on this show, I should add, a few times. I should have asked him about it, really. Just remind us how Epstein was involved somehow in shutting you down and your co-author?
Well, they didn't shut us down. Steve Walt and I wrote this famous article on the Israel lobby, which came out in March 2006. And then, of course, the book came out a little bit more than a year later in 2007. But anyway, when the London Review of Books article came out in March 2006, many people in the lobby went after us. And one of our most devoted opponents was Alan Dershowitz. He really put his gun sights on us, and he went to great lengths to discredit us.
He usually speaks up for free speech. Actually, he has done on this show.
He speaks up for free speech when it doesn't involve Israel. He does not believe in free speech when it comes to Israel. He's deeply interested in suppressing free speech because he knows very well that if you have an open discourse on Israel, on the lobby, and on the U.S.-Israeli relationship, he loses at every turn. So he goes to great lengths to suppress people who talk critically about Israel or the U.S.-Israeli relationship. And that's what he tried to do with us. But what we didn't know at the time was that he was working with Jeffrey Epstein to do everything that he could to attack us and delegitimize us. I don't think I even knew who Jeffrey Epstein was at the time, much less that Dershowitz was coordinating his efforts with Epstein to discredit us.
And so, in a way, Epstein being a state actor, Israeli state actor, through this?
I think that's much too strong. I don't think he's an Israeli state actor. I think that Jeffrey Epstein, like Alan Dershowitz, is passionately attached to Israel. He cared greatly about Israel, and that's why he was willing to help Israel in all sorts of ways. A lot of emails and documents have already come out that show that Epstein was doing everything he could to help Israel. And I would imagine when the Justice Department releases all these documents, and then these two courts release this grand jury testimony, that we'll see even more evidence that Epstein was working overtime to help Israel, as was Dershowitz. But the fact is that Dershowitz and Epstein were not formally employed by the Israeli government. That was not necessary. They were so devoted to Israel that they would do everything possible to help Israel.
Certainly not formally. And when the Justice Department released the unredacted versions, yeah, maybe we will find out. But I suppose coming from you who helped publicize the extent of the Israeli lobby, you must have been impressed how the Israel lobby has failed during a genocide to be able to be as persuasive for a whole new generation of Americans, let alone Western Europeans, who don't believe Israel anymore. And in that context, I don't know what you think about the massive media mergers or proposed mergers over this year. CNN a pawn in the blockbuster takeover battle. CNN, Paramount, Warner Brothers, all these configurations being discussed. I don't know whether to get a better handle over the propaganda system in your country.
I think it's really quite amazing what's happening here. The fact is that because of social media, Israel has suffered enormous damage in terms of world opinion and in terms of public opinion in the United States. It's really quite stunning how much damage Israel has done to its reputation, although it's not terribly surprising when you think about the impact of social media, especially organizations like TikTok. But anyway, the lobby has decided that what they're going to do is try and shut down social media from criticizing Israel. They're going to go to great lengths to take over various platforms and force platforms that they don't take over to vary their content to minimize the criticism of Israel. I don't think that can be done at this point in time. I think the cat is out of the bag, as we like to say. I think people now fully understand that Israel is an apartheid state and it has been executing a genocide. And you can't erase that from people's minds. They've seen it. They've seen all the evidence that they need to see to reach that conclusion. And I think it's going to be exceedingly difficult for the lobby to change people's opinions. And in fact, I think the more heavy-handed the lobby is, the more the lobby engages in smash mouth politics, the more people are going to get angry with the lobby for basically violating basic freedom of speech principles here in the United States. I think at this point in time, the greatest threat to free speech in the United States comes from Israel's supporters who go to enormous lengths to curb free speech. And you see this even on university campuses, which used to be paragons of free speech. The lobby is working overtime inside universities, inside colleges, to suppress any critical comments on Israel.
But do you think Netanyahu can persuade Trump to go into Iran again? They obviously were quick to use atrocities as excuses for U.S. support on another bombing campaign against Iran.
I do not think Trump is going to be interested in doing another Iran. I'm not even sure the Israelis are that interested. Uh, you want to remember that in the last war, as I said at the top of the show, this is, of course, the June 12-day war. The Israelis did not do very well. There's no question that they succeeded with a surprise attack against Iran. They caught the Iranians with their pants down, but they won't catch the Iranians with their pants down next time because they were fooled once, the Iranians, but they will not be fooled again. But even though they were fooled the first time, if you look at the exchanges that took place between Israel and Iran, the Iranians, by the end of the conflict, were getting the better of the Israelis. And the Iranians, in fact, have a huge arsenal of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. And Israel, in many ways, is a big fat target. And I don't think the Israelis are going to be anxious to start another war with Iran. But furthermore, just going back to the United States, you want to remember that one of the reasons that we were so anxious to end the June 12-day war was because we had evidence that the Iranians were thinking about shutting down the Straits of Hormuz or shutting down the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf. And that really spooked us because the economic consequences for the world economy would have been disastrous. And that threat remains. And I think if the Iranians are smart, they should tell the Israelis and tell the Americans that if they attack again, there's a very good chance that the Iranians will shut down the Gulf.
Professor John Mearsheimer, I'll stop you there. More from the University of Chicago scholar after this break. Welcome back to Going Underground. I'm still here with the Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer. Professor, you were talking about how we may be a bit more relaxed about the prospects for a war on Iran in 2026. I don't know what you thought of more generally about the national security strategy released at the end of 2025. Trump talking towards the end of the year about a new C5 group, USA, China, Russia, India, Japan. I mean, do you think in 2026 the United States could leave NATO?
I don't think the United States is likely to leave NATO. I think the really interesting question is, to what extent do we reduce our military footprint in Europe? If you read the new national security strategy document, it's quite clear that the Trump administration wants to focus mainly on East Asia. They want to deal mainly with the China threat. And of course, they also care greatly about the Western Hemisphere. And the place they want to reduce the American commitment to is Europe. The contempt for the Europeans reflected in that document is quite significant. And furthermore, we know from events over this past year that what the Trump administration wants to do is shift the burden for dealing with Ukraine to the shoulders of the Europeans. In other words, the United States wants to get out of the game of supporting Ukraine and turn that mission over to the Europeans. So I think all of this tells you that what we are likely to do in the years ahead is reduce the military footprint, the U.S. military footprint in Europe. I'd be very surprised if that meant we left NATO. But I would not be surprised if we greatly reduce our military presence in Europe so that we can increase our military presence in East Asia.
Professor Sachs, who I know, Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia, I know you differ from him on China, on that China threat, but he's recently been saying that the Monroe Doctrine from 1823 explicitly says there's an issue of reciprocity. The U.S. will not intervene in European affairs in exchange for the Western Hemisphere. If, as you say, they're going to reduce the military footprint, I mean, could we see closure of these German bases? There are many thousands of troops, of course, in Germany and Britain and Italy.
I think it's possible that you'll see the closure of some bases in Germany, and I think you'll see a reduction in the troop levels. But again, I don't think you're going to see the end of NATO and the United States leaving NATO, which would mean we would leave all those military bases in Germany. I don't think that's going to happen. With regard to Jeff's point about reciprocity, it's just important to understand the United States does not believe in reciprocity. The United States believes there are two sets of rules, rules for the United States and rules for everybody else. And other countries are not allowed to put military forces in the Western Hemisphere because that's our backyard. But we, the United States, are allowed to put our military forces in their backyards. And of course, this is what NATO expansion into Ukraine was all about. We thought that we had the God-given right to put military forces in Ukraine, even though it was right on Russia's doorsteps, and the Russians protested as if they had their own Monroe Doctrine. We just rejected that, and we do the same thing in East Asia. We're right in China's face in East Asia, and we have no intention of leaving. But of course, we've made it clear to the Chinese that because of the Monroe Doctrine, they're not allowed to come into our backyard. So the whole idea of reciprocity when it comes to the United States is irrelevant.
Except that maybe there will be an element of reciprocity if there's this withdrawal of troops. You've been talking all year about the issue of Europe and perhaps European collapse, I don't know, as it continues to forge the war and try to sabotage the peace plans that Trump comes up with. I mean, do you think he wouldn't be able to withdraw these troops after the midterms? I mean, do you think the European powers, too, are keeping an eye on those midterms and just waiting for Trump to go? That there is some kind of sense in their policy of trying to continue the war on Russia through Ukraine without the finances or military to support it, because they can wait for a president that's more usual in terms of recent history in the United States to forge the war on Russia before China?
Well, there's a couple points to be made there. First of all, Trump has not even been in the White House for 1 year. It won't be until this coming January 20th, which is a good month away, that he reaches the 1 year mark. And he has 3 years left after that. So it's a long wait for the Europeans, and Trump can do a lot of damage in the meantime. Second point I'd make is who's going to succeed Trump? If they get J.D. Vance, he won't be any different than Trump. Uh, and the third point is there's no question that the Europeans are going to continue to try to support Ukraine and keep it in the fight. I don't think that's possible, though, certainly for another 3 years. I'd be surprised if Ukraine lasts for another year. I believe it's on the ropes at this point in time. So I think the scenario you described may be attractive in principle to the Europeans, but in practice, I just don't think it's going to work.
So what's going through the minds then of BlackRock, Mertz, and Starmer and Macron? What possibly is their strategy as they appear to have these meetings all year? They've had strange meetings where the United States sometimes isn't even represented, whilst relying massively on U.S. power for their war on Russia.
Well, when you watch what they're doing and you think about the arguments they're putting forth and how they are not at all going to appeal to the Russians, you sometimes think that they're living on another planet. This just makes no sense at all. There's no chance of getting a meaningful peace agreement between the Europeans and the Ukrainians on one side and the Russians on the other side. So what are they doing? I think that what you have here is a situation where the sunk costs are just so great that it's almost impossible for these European leaders who have made such a great effort on Ukraine's behalf to quit and to reach some sort of negotiated settlement that would represent a Russian victory. So they continue to push on, hoping for a miracle. But they surely have to understand that the chances of Ukraine winning this one before Trump's leaves office is almost zero in terms of probabilities. It's just hard to see how that can happen.
So, if it hasn't happened already by the time this is broadcast, what are the dangers of false flag operations created by European powers trying in an attempt to divert Trump's attention away from Venezuela and policy considerations in the Western Hemisphere back to the war on Russia? The head of MI6, very voluble, it's almost unprecedented, loudly proclaiming, and I think she's the granddaughter of a Nazi, she proudly talking about the importance of the war on Russia during negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, the very interesting question is what does the end game look like here? I mean, I think you're eventually going to get a frozen conflict. You're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement because the demands on the two sides are so far apart. So at some point, I think you'll get an armistice, something along the lines of what you got after the Korean War ended in 1953. But getting to that frozen conflict could be very tricky. You want to remember that if the Ukrainians lose, that will put the Europeans in a desperate situation. They'll be desperate, and they'll be looking for some way to rescue the situation. And you talk about possible false
But
flag
why will they be
operations
desperate, though?
because they have convinced themselves that losing to the Russians would be catastrophic. You want to remember that this is not just a war between Ukraine and Russia, that NATO is almost fully committed to this war. Of course, we've not had NATO soldiers on the ground doing the fighting, or we've not had NATO pilots in the air. But NATO otherwise has been completely committed to helping Ukraine win this war. And we have fought this war for over 3 years now, almost 4 years. And for NATO to lose to Russia will be a humiliating defeat. And the Europeans will be desperate to see if they can find a way to avoid that. And that's why your point about false flag operations, all for the purposes of dragging the United States back into the fight in a more full-fledged way so that the United States can help pull the Europeans' chestnuts out of the fire, the temptation to do that will be very great. And I think that we have to worry about the serious possibility of escalation once we head towards the end game here.
Well, that's obviously very frightening indeed. Just finally, I suppose perhaps the most important issue, although obviously the nuclear option remains there in Western Europe. START treaty expires on 5th February 2026. Just finally, very briefly, what are the prospects for some kind of renewal of a nuclear arms treaty between Russia and the United States that can further avert the prospects of global annihilation?
Well, Trump has said on a number of occasions that he's inclined to prolong the START treaty, the new START treaty. Whether he does that remains to be seen. He definitely is interested in having good relations with Vladimir Putin and with Russia more generally, and that would go along with pushing this treaty forward or extending this treaty. In the final analysis, I just don't think it matters very much. The fact is that the Russians and the United States are both in the process of modernizing their strategic nuclear forces. And this treaty, whether it continues or not, it's not going to make that much difference. But the more important point is that treaty was constructed in a bipolar world where there were two superpowers, right? The United States and the Soviet Union, and later the United States and Russia. But there's now a third player in the game, and that player is a very important player, which of course is China. And if you're going to have meaningful strategic nuclear arms control moving forward, it can't be just Russia and the United States. It has to be Russia, China, and the United States. And as you well know, we had a devil of a time getting arms control agreements of any consequence during the Cold War when there were just two actors in the system, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now we're talking about getting arms control agreements when there are three actors in the system. That's going to be extremely difficult to do. So I think whether or not this new START agreement is pushed forward matters on the margins at best.
Professor John Mearsheimer, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show.
And that's it for the final show of this season. Our continued condolences to all those suffering the impact of the US-UK EU armed genocide in Gaza and all those impacted by the bloodshed of 2025 caused by the US military-industrial complex. We'll be back with a brand new season on Saturday, the 24th of January. Until then, get in touch via all our social media. If it's not censored in your country, and head to our channel, Going Underground TV on rumble.com to watch new and old episodes of Going Underground. From the whole team here at Going Underground, we wish you a happy and peaceful new year. See you soon.